Hello and welcome to TVP World. And welcome to Ukraine This Week with me, Alex Zemlinsky, stepping in for Don Arleth. Today we will discuss the most important events of the past week from the perspective of Ukraine. In particular, the visit to Kyiv by US and UK diplomatic chiefs Antony Blinken and David Lammy. We will also address with our guests the recent presidential debate between Kamala Harris and Donald Trump and the increasing impact of the upcoming US presidential election on the situation of the embattled Ukraine. But first, let's start with an overview of the highlights from the past week, straight from Ukraine. Never since the start of this war have we seen an attack on Moscow on this scale. Russia says it shot down 144 Ukrainian drones over Russian territory on Tuesday.
At least one person was killed in the attack, according to Russian authorities. 3 of Moscow's 4 airports temporarily suspended their operations following the strike. Several apartments were damaged and caught fire as a result of the operation, the biggest such attack since the start of the war. The Kremlin commented after the attack that it showed that the Kyiv regime is Russia's enemy and reminded Russia about the need to keep fighting against it. Ukraine has not commented on the strike.
The U.S. has announced a new $700 million humanitarian aid package for Ukraine.
New aid was announced by the U.S. Secretary of State during his visit to Kyiv. It plans to cover the country's critical infrastructure, support the displaced Ukrainians, and help the demining efforts on Ukrainian soil. That announcement was made during the joint trip of the U.S. Secretary of State and British Foreign Secretary to Kyiv. The United Kingdom has announced a similar package to their partners from across the pond. London has pledged to give Ukraine aid worth £600 million British pounds.
Russian attacks on Ukraine over the past day have killed 10 and injured 41. Humanitarian aid workers and emergency service employees are among the victims.
The Ukrainian Air Force Command claims that Ukrainian forces shot down 24 of 26 Russian drones launched overnight. However, that ratio was not enough to prevent casualties. Deadly attacks took place in several locations across Ukraine. One of the attacks killed 3 Red Cross staff members and injured 2 in a village in the eastern Ukrainian Donetsk region.
1 month after Ukraine launched an attack on Russia's Kursk region, Moscow is fighting back. Putin's troops have retaken several settlements in the region, according to announcements from one major general.
Ukraine has confirmed that the Russian counteroffensive has started in the Kursk region. President Zelenskyy has said that so far, though, everything is going according to Ukraine's plans. The Ukrainian offensive in the Kursk region of Russia, which borders Ukraine, has been ongoing since August 6th. According to Ukrainian army sources, it was able to claim well over 1,000 square kilometers of Russian soil and some 100 settlements. From the start of the operation, Kyiv was clear that they do not plan to occupy the area for the long term and has claimed to have started the operation for technical operational considerations.
The Turkish president has said that Crimea needs to return to Ukraine in order for the war to end justly.
Thank you so much.
Turkey is a NATO member who for the past few years has balanced between the East and West in its foreign policy. During Ukraine's Crimea platform, Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan has expressed a clearly pro-Ukrainian message. Crimea is internationally recognized by the world as part of Ukraine. The Kremlin, however, considers it Russian territory. It was the first Ukrainian region to be seized and annexed by Russia since the war between Ukraine and Russia started back in 2014. Turkey's president said, quote, "Our support for Ukraine's territorial integrity, sovereignty and independence remains unwavering. The return of Crimea to Ukraine is a requirement of international law. Crimea is the home of the Crimean Tatar minority. Just like the Turks, they are a Turkic ethnic group."
And there are first hints that one day Stockholm may give Ukraine fighter jets of Swedish production.
The Gripen fighter jet is the jewel in the crown of Swedish defense manufacturing. The jet is known for its high maneuverability and relatively low weight. Although seeing such machines in Ukraine is probably a distant prospect at this point, the Swedish government has made the first steps to supplying Ukraine with the Gripens. Stockholm's latest Ukraine aid package includes spare parts for the Swedish fighter jets. That, according to the Swedish Defense Ministry, opens the door for a debate on whether such machines should be given to Ukraine. It has been reported that so far, though, no such discussions have been taking place.
And now it's time to look at the war in Ukraine through the lens of a journalist. And for that, we are joined by our correspondent in Kyiv, Oz Chatterjee. So, hello Oz, what can you tell us about the situation in the Kursk region?
So this week, the much anticipated Russian counteroffensive in the Kursk region, the Ukraine-occupied Kursk region, I should say, began in earnest. This was announced by Zelenskyy himself. There's been a lot of diplomatic things happening here, lots of political developments happening on the ground here in Kyiv. But really, the big story this week is also what's happening in Kursk. Now, the Ukrainians have been preparing for this for some time. In fact, that's all Zelenskyy said, really. He said it's all going to our Ukrainian plans. So very vague comments about the actual situation. But the Ukrainians did go in and they have been expecting the Russians to try and take back some of that land. That is anticipated. How successful the campaign to defend that occupied territory will be remains to be seen in the coming weeks. The Russians did, in the first opening day, manage to retake 10 settlements. They managed to recross the Same River that the Ukrainians had so effectively destroyed bridges and pontoon bridges over the past few weeks. However, this was not enough to stop this advance on the western flank of the Kursk region that Ukraine occupies, and the Russians were able to take about 10 settlements, which is roughly 10% of the territory that Ukraine had before this counteroffensive began. Now, heavy fighting is ongoing. Ukrainian troops and supplies are still heading into the Kursk region, so there's no sign of an immediate withdrawal or anything like that, but it's one to watch, certainly, going forward, to see just how much Ukraine is going to try and cling on to that land, and just how much Russia's going to commit to try and take that land back now, particularly when they're still trying to push in the Donetsk region.
All right, and that was Oz Chatterjee coming to us from Ukraine. Thank you very much for that report. It's been a busy week for Ukrainian diplomacy. Kyiv has received many of its partners and has tried to communicate its military and humanitarian needs firsthand to each of the visiting partners and friends.
The highest representatives of each of the three Baltic states have visited Ukraine this week. Lithuania, Latvia and Estonia are leading the charts when it comes to government support for Ukraine relative to the sizes of their economies. Since all three were once part of the Soviet Union, they are especially sensitive to the matter of Russian war crimes and holding them to account.
Lithuania calls on international organizations to be more outspoken about Russia's illegal occupation and ongoing human rights abuses in Crimea and other occupied territories. We also support the creation of the Special International Tribunal to prosecute those responsible for the crime of aggression.
But Kyiv saw not just the visits of the biggest supporters per capita, but also the biggest ones overall. The US Secretary of State and the British Foreign Secretary took the trip to Kyiv together, once again pledging more aid.
More ammunition, more armoured vehicles, more support to Ukraine's military effort at this time. And we're here to listen. And that's why I'm here with Antony Blinken, a US Secretary of State, a UK Foreign Secretary, travelling together. We haven't seen that for well over a decade in our system, travelling here to listen to the Ukrainians, to speak to President Zelenskyy, to hear and understand.
Ukraine is signaling that it's ready for peace, but it wants something it calls a just peace. And that plan requires juicing up the Ukrainian armed forces before the negotiations fully take off.
We're working with urgency to continue to ensure that Ukraine has what it needs to effectively defend itself.
Before the visit, the US president said that his administration had been working on lifting the restrictions on the use of long-range weapons for Ukraine. In this sense, the visit of the British and American foreign secretaries was a disappointment, as it didn't bring the breakthrough that the Ukrainians were waiting for.
It is important to lift all restrictions on the use of American and British weapons against lawful targets on Russian territory. We need decisiveness also with regards to shooting down Russian missiles and drones in Ukrainian airspace. The further Ukraine can strike, the closer a just peace will be.
Ukraine has solid declarations of support, but it still must wait a bit longer for that additional milestone in the West's military support in the face of the Russian invasion.
Great job.
And joining us now to discuss this further is Reuben Johnson, Research Fellow, Casimir Pulaski Foundation. Good afternoon and welcome to TVP World.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
So now, what do you think when it comes to the visits of Secretary Antony Blinken and Foreign Secretary David Lammy? What are the most important takeaways from this visit to Ukraine?
Well, the two foreign ministers of the two countries which have offered probably the greatest diplomatic and military assistance, that was important because, of course, David Lammy represents a new government, and the new prime minister has been very vocal about Russia's culpability in this war. So that was important, from a standpoint of reinforcing support for Ukraine. It was also important from the standpoint that they had discussions about freeing up Ukraine to use its long-range donated weaponry. So that's the Storm Shadow missiles produced in the United Kingdom and France, the ATACMS missiles that's produced in the United States, freeing up Ukraine to use those to strike any target, anywhere, instead of just limiting them to targets inside of Ukraine or just across the Russian border.
And now, since you mentioned that, this brings me to my next question. When do you think, because this was something that many had been anticipating, when will we see the green light for just that?
That's a great question. Lots of us were thinking that we'd get that green light today. And once again, the decision is moved to the right. And it's very disappointing because it causes one to question whether or not there's actually a strategy for victory on the U.S. and the Allied side. Do they have a strategy other than just saying, well, as long as we don't lose, we win, or as long as Ukraine doesn't lose, we win? When you don't have a strategy, you're almost guaranteed of a negative outcome. This is becoming really concerning. We're told that these discussions will go on, and I'm sure when there's a final disposition to this question, it'll be disappointing as well. It'll be, again, too restrictive on what the Ukrainians are allowed to do to defend themselves.
So in your opinion, does the U.S., does the West have a strategy on how to win this war?
It doesn't appear to have one, and this is not just me saying this, but there are people who have spent far more time, far more years analyzing the Russian military than I, and looking at the situation and just saying very clearly that not only is there no strategy, but there's almost a reflexive, knee reflexive disposition on the part of the U.S. administration. They refuse to even entertain talking about a strategy. So it's a very weak position, and it basically tells Vladimir Putin that we don't have the will to really carry this thing through to the logical end, that he can wait us out, that he can keep sending people into the battlefield to die, and he can keep sending third-rate equipment to be blown up. He can do that longer than we're willing to stay in the game and see him defeated.
Now, what about, because Putin has said that NATO will be at war with Moscow if Ukraine fires long-range missiles from the West at Russia. Can the U.S., can the West call Putin's bluff without triggering a catastrophe?
Well, first of all, we're at war already. Most people just don't realize it. Second part, yes, because, okay, Putin is always, doing this, it's the same old shtick, the same old game. It's this nuclear saber rattling. And there's all kinds of reasons that, some of them have been rather eloquently listed by the current Polish foreign minister, Mr. Sikorski, about how the nuclear weapons are unusable. But a colleague of mine recently wrote something for the Atlantic Council in which he explained in the 1970s, way back when the Soviet military was a professional organization and not this ramshackle army we see now, they conducted simulations on using tactical nuclear weapons on the battlefield. And okay, you can use a tactical nuke to blow a hole in the front lines of your adversary, but you can't send anybody in through that hole to exploit the breakthrough, because you're sending them into a radiation cloud and they're all going to die. So again, this is an empty threat, and he keeps using it, and he keeps using it because it keeps working.
So now, what about, do you think, is Ukrainian society ready for peace talk? Is there public consent for the authorities to direct policy towards peace talks? And is Ukrainian society aware that at this stage, the armed conflict seems to be unresolvable?
Well, okay. Number one, there is I would call it a lack of consensus within Ukrainian society, and it is widening, and this has been documented. There's been some recent very good pieces written about this, but there are people back behind the lines who are saying, oh yeah, maybe we should negotiate. But they are completely at odds with the soldiers in the field who are fighting the war. There's a deepening chasm between those fighting and those not fighting. But the reason that this is, perhaps unresolvable, it goes back to the question of deep strikes on Russian territory. I mean, you are never going to defeat the Russian military going head to head with them, because they've got more people they can shove in front of bullets to die than you do. So you're going to have to adopt an anti-Clausewitzian approach. You're going to have to look at the Russian military as an aquarium. You're going to have to say, I'm going to drain all the water out of this fish tank, and the fish are going to be flopping around gasping for air. The only way you can do that is to hit targets deep in Russia that take out their logistics, their energy production centers, their gasoline stockpiles, their ammunition stockpiles, their railheads. You've got to empty the water out of that tank so they have nothing to use. That's the only way this is winnable, and that only happens if you've got unrestricted capability to strike those military targets. In contrast to the Russians, I might remind everyone, but they don't bother with military targets. They just send missiles and they hit hospitals, schools, educational institutions of higher education, civilian targets, apartment buildings, you name it. All the Ukrainians are asking for is the right to hit legitimate military targets.
Right. And now, do you think, will the occupied territories in the Kursk region be a Ukrainian argument before or during possible peace talks?
Well, during, obviously, both before and during. Zelensky's already said we're holding on to this, and we're going to prove that we can take a piece of Russia and hold it. And, the Russians claim they're making a counteroffensive, they're making counter moves, they claim to have taken some 10 settlements. But you have to question whether that's sustainable, partly because of the rather disorganized manner in which the Russian military operates. And secondly, because it's not a military, it's military, plural. There's the Russian army. There's remnants of the Wagner group. There are SVU units. There are Nacgvardia, Rosgvardia units. There are Chechen units. It's a hodgepodge of different organizations fighting on the front line, many times who are fighting each other stronger than or more viciously than they're fighting the Ukrainians.
And now, I know we spoke about this at the beginning of our conversation, speaking about the takeaways of the visit of Secretary Blinken and Foreign Secretary David Lammy. But what do you think was the purpose of the visit by these two heads of diplomacy to Kyiv? Do you think maybe was it to change the attitude of President Zelensky's administration towards ending the war?
I'm sure that was a secondary, perhaps, point of discussion. I think that it was more important that, first of all, you have a meeting in Kyiv with the new UK government and with the outgoing American government. Secretary Blinken was in Kyiv, and he's indicated that if Kamala Harris were to win the election, he will not be serving a second term. He's tired, he's exhausted, he's got 2 young children he wants to spend time with, and he doesn't want to go through another 4 years of what he's had thus far. So important from a standpoint of almost like passing a baton. That's one. Secondly, there's been a shakeup in the Ukrainian government, which happened a short while ago, and probably important at this point for the governments of the U.S. and the UK to talk to those new heads of the ministries and try to get a better understanding of what is the new orientation of the Zelensky government, if any.
Right, and this brings me to my next question, because we've learned that President Zelenskyy has said he's been pretty tight-lipped about it, having said no details, but saying that he is going to provide a peace point plan to President Biden. So do you think, is Ukraine beginning to take an increasingly pragmatic approach towards ending this war?
Well, pragmatic, yes, but also pragmatic, or I should say also realistic in the sense that they are performing better against the Russians than they have for a long time in the field. And there are all sorts of indicators that life in Russia is becoming progressively worse. I mean, one of the last Ukrainian drone attacks hit apartment buildings in the village of Ramenskoye, which is to the southeast of Moscow. It's also a place where some of the Russians' most sensitive and important defense industrial test and research facilities are located. And it was a real signal that we can reach out and touch you any place you are. You're not safe anywhere. And so from that standpoint, I think they believe now is the time when Putin may feel his position is weaker than it was, say, 2.5 years ago when the war first started.
And now, what does the United States require of Ukraine? What does Europe require of Ukraine? And then what does Ukraine require of all its allies?
Well, the United States and Europe, if they could ask for anything from Ukraine, it's probably one of the key difficulties is some improvement. I would say not just some, but major improvements in the process of recruiting, of conscripting, training, of ensuring that those personnel put into the field are competent, they're trained, they're capable, they're well led. I mean, the operation of the Ukrainian military in this invasion of the Kursk region has shown them to be extremely capable in what we call maneuver warfare to a level I'm sure most people couldn't have anticipated. So you can't ask for them to be much more proficient on the battlefield, but what happens behind, making sure that their military is not like the Russians, where they're hauling people out of prisons and dragging people off the street and just shoving them in front of bullets. But what Ukraine requires from the West is some far more expeditious process of providing the vital assets that the Ukrainians need. They need more air defense. They need more missiles to fill those air defense batteries. That's not going to happen until production is expanded. One of the key short-range air defense systems that the Ukrainians have is the ground-launched Iris-T from Germany. The missile for that system is made in a small town of about 20,000 people. It's almost not a production line. It's almost a boutique. So until these countries get really serious and they start building bigger factories, and until their ministries of defense start putting in orders that says we will buy so many of these for the next 5, 6, 7 years, so that there's a predictable level of procurement, so that the companies can comfortably and they can feel, confident that they can go out and hire more people and build more buildings. That's what Ukraine requires of the West. Act like this is a real war. This is not just one of these 2-week conflicts like we got used to over the last 30 years, like Operation Desert Storm. This is a really long, protracted conflict. You've got to act like that's what it is.
All right, and with that message, we'll be ending it there. Reuben Johnson, Research Fellow, Casimir Pulaski Foundation, thank you very much for speaking to us here on Ukraine This Week.
Thank you again for having me.
The war in Ukraine has been going on for well over 2 years now. America has been leading the Western world's efforts to aid Kyiv. Now, as Washington, D.C. stands at a crossroads, we take a look at each presidential candidate's plan for the war-torn nation.
Although the war in Ukraine did not dominate the US presidential debate in Philadelphia, it still played an important part in it. Out of the two candidates, it seems as though Vice President Harris's Ukraine vision is less ambiguous. Trump's message was about ending the war as soon as possible, without giving much more detail. The main claim that Trump makes about the war is that it could have been prevented if he were in office.
Everything they said was weak and stupid. They said the wrong things. That war should have never started. She was the emissary. They sent her in to negotiate with Zelenskyy and Putin, and she did. And the war started 3 days later. And that's the kind of talent we have with her.
Kamala Harris has been more precise on the topic of aid to Kyiv. She is generally expected to continue the legacy of the Biden administration on that front. Unlike Trump, Harris was also clear that she believes Ukraine is defending the values that hundreds of years ago built America.
The reality is it has been about standing as America always should, as a leader upholding international rules and norms. That the alliances we have around the world are dependent on our ability to look out for our friends and not favor our enemies because you adore strongmen instead of caring about democracy.
Kyiv has diplomatically not taken sides in the race for the White House. President Zelenskyy has stated multiple times that he would be happy to cooperate with any of the candidates. At the same time, Ukraine knows that it cannot win this war without Washington's support. The peace plan, which President Zelenskyy calls the plan for victory, is being crafted in Kyiv before it can be unveiled at a peace summit this fall. It seems as though the Biden administration will be the main recipients of the document, and that's why the work on it is done in consultation with the White House.
I'll talk it over with President Biden first, because the plan mostly depends on the support of the United States and other partners. But I think that everyone understands that there is a volume of influence and a volume of assistance, and therefore there are no superfluous words here. It seems to me that it is clear why I will do it in this order.
What the plan will ultimately look like is a mystery, although so far Ukraine has repeated time and again that it's not going to give up any of its rightful territories to Russia.
And now joining us to discuss this topic further is Gary Tabach, former Chief of Staff, NATO Military Liaison Mission in Moscow. Good afternoon and welcome to TVP World.
Hello, hi, it's good to be on TVP World.
So now we're after, of course, the first presidential debate between the two American candidates for the president of the US. So now, if the 47th president of the United States becomes Kamala Harris, will she continue Joe Biden's cabinet policy on the war in Ukraine?
Well, I think my impression she will, because the staff and the cabinet will remain pretty much the same as it was under President Obama and then President Biden. And I think it will continue that way with President Kamala Harris. So, if we're going to get the same thing and the ideology remains to be the same, we see that not much should be changing. And Kamala Harris did put out, or her staff did put out, somewhat of her presidential plan, and there was no mention of Ukraine. The main goal was climate and dealing with climate change and so forth. But Ukraine was not mentioned in her presidential plan.
So then that would mean good news for Ukraine, right?
I don't think so, because Ukraine's been fighting and bleeding very, very hard. We've been promising, Rammstein 125 already. We've been promising to Ukraine, committing a lot of funds, but not delivering. And right now, at this point, what I see is we have over $9 billion sitting in our budget that is allocated for Ukraine for military equipment and military assistance, but is not delivered to Ukraine as it was last year. And it would be either given back now because it wasn't spent, the White House never released it, given back to our budgetary office, or it will be carried over to the next year and has to be voted again by our Congress to be again allocated to Ukraine, which of course it's a political game, because that again would come in a package. For instance, in that package we expect that there will be voting without identification cards and voting for illegal immigrants and so forth, that the Republican Party probably unlikely to vote for. And it again will be blamed that they're not willing to to assist Ukraine or release funds for Ukraine, as it was done before. But even later, after 3 months of negotiating and fighting in the Congress, it was voted on $61 billion package, which Ukraine was supposed to get about 12 billion. It got a little bit over $1 billion, and 9 billion is still sitting there, is not being delivered. So I don't think we should expect good news if Kamala Harris wins for Ukraine.
Given everything that you just said now, why is the U.S., why is it so slow in moving its feet? And do you think, does the U.S. actually have a plan on how to, continue and on how to help Ukraine win this war?
Unfortunately not. Unfortunately, for 2 years, we have been trying to get the plan, from the White House. And as I've said, the last time we voted in Congress for that $61 billion, part of the law, the United States law we voted in, that the president has to submit a plan within 40 days of what the goal is, how we should go about it. There are about 12 questions that were created by Senator Hernandez, and it was never answered. So that plan has never been given to our Congress, to the American people, as the American people did vote through our Congress by supermajority for land lease, and not one can of Spam was released to Ukraine under that program of land lease about 2 years ago. So I don't think we should expect much change from it, because the United States, I think, in the face of the White House and administration, is really want Ukraine to win, or for that war to end in Ukraine's favor.
And now, what about if the 47th president of the U.S. were to become Donald Trump? What do you think, what might we expect from him and his administration in this regard?
Well, again, I'm not a future teller, but from the past, we know that it was our Congress in 2014 voted, again, by the supermajority to give Ukraine, when the Russians annexed Crimea and Donbass area, lethal weapons such as Stingers and sniper rifles and javelins. And it was Obama-Biden administration that put a veto on it and also put an embargo so other countries could not sell lethal weapons to Ukraine. But when Trump came into the White House in 2017, that was one of the first things he did. He lifted that embargo and that veto, and the Ukrainians received those weapons, and this is the weapons they were able to repel the Russian attack in 2022. So now what President Trump is saying is that he will end the war, and he will end that war very quickly. One of the main ways he was going to do it is by allowing the United States again to drill oil. And he says that drill, baby, drill, to drill oil and bring the prices down as they were under him in the past, to about $40 a barrel, which will starve, as he says, our enemy. And he mentions Iran, he mentions Venezuela and Russia. And he also is saying that his policy will be peace through strength, meaning that he is going to give weapons to Ukraine. He also talked about drones to Ukraine. He also told President Putin that if Putin attacks Ukraine, he'll send our nuclear submarines that will patrol up and down the Russian coast. So, I mean, he said many of things, that he will show muscle, that he will show leadership in the world, and leadership in our country and outside of our country. So, in my humble opinion, I think that if Trump comes, this war will come to at least a halt, at least. But at best, it will stop. And again, when he was a president for 4 years, there were no wars started. As a matter of fact, we finished many wars, and no wars ever started under him. All those tyrants sat very quietly. Today, we have at least 2 major wars going on.
And now, what about What do we know about the peace formula that President Zelenskyy recently announced, called Victory Plan for Ukraine? Do you think, might this be some kind of PR game to show the West that, look, we are working on a peace formula, but then at the same time, Kyiv is aware that Ukrainian society will not accept, further accessions, especially territorial ones. So to what extent will the internal politics of the Zelenskyy administration and the Ukrainian political scene as a whole influence the further course of this war or its suspension?
Well, I think there are a lot of speculations are going on what it is, and you're absolutely right. All the politicians, no matter which country they are, no matter where they are, partially of it is a PR and spinning things out of reality. But the reality is such that Ukrainian people are not willing to give up their land. The Ukrainian people are fighting very, very hard for almost 3 years. They're paying a huge price. They don't want it to be in vain, that's for sure. I just attended the funeral of a son of a chief rabbi of Kyiv who died at the front. This is very moving things that the Ukrainians are not willing to give up. So I don't know what that plan will hold or what kind of negotiations it will be. But as long as Ukrainians are able to hold on to the Kursk region, then the negotiations will be in their favor. So we will see. I think there is a reality check has to be done. As long as Putin in power, then the negotiations are going to be very, very, very tough. And again, this conflict cannot be resolved simply by military force. There has to be some serious sanctions that do work. Fast, quick sanctions, not the ones that have been dragging for 3 years, or like in the case of Iran for 40 years, and they really have done very little damage. As a matter of fact, I think Russia benefited from those sanctions. They're not real. And political pressures, and then serious military help for Ukraine. We better rally ourselves around Ukraine quickly before this really gets out of hand, in my opinion.
And now, what about, do you think, will the occupied territories in the Kursk region be a Ukrainian argument before or during possible peace talks?
Well, it depends on us how much support we will provide to Ukrainians to hold that land that they were able to capture. And again, that definitely is an ace in their hand, because this is something they can negotiate. And this is what happened. Because previously Putin kept saying, as Hitler has done it before, saying, I want peace. I want to negotiate. It is the Ukrainians who do not want to negotiate. And everybody knew what his negotiations were gonna hold. It was going to be that we're going to stop fighting. It's going to be ceasefire on the front line. Wherever the front line is, this is where we stop. Well, now he cannot use that argument, because then the Ukrainians will be inside of Russia, on a Russian land, which Putin will not be able to survive. And now it is President Zelenskyy who is saying, okay, well, we're willing to negotiate. Now let's negotiate, which Putin is refusing to do because he knows he doesn't have that ace in his hand. He doesn't have that negotiation advantage.
All right, and with that, we'll end it there. Gary Tabach, former Chief of Staff, NATO Military Liaison Mission in Moscow. Thank you very much for speaking to us here on Ukraine This Week.
Thank you for inviting. Bye-bye.
And that's all for this edition of Ukraine This Week, but do join us next week for the next episode. I'm Alex Simlinski, stepping in for Don Arleth. Thanks for watching. See you soon.